Massachusetts has always been at the heart of the American story. From one of its earliest settlements, accidental though it was, to the spark for the American Revolution, the abolitionist movement before the Civil War, its machine politics during the 20th century, and its tech future. So how did a place with such an inauspicious start end up being central to the American experience? To find out, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Massachusetts. The first inhabitants of Massachusetts were nomadic hunters that arrived in New England sometime around 12,000 years ago. Some of their hunting tools have been found in what is now Canton, Massachusetts, a place that they used as a seasonal campground. In the following millennia, a number of native peoples made Massachusetts their home. One of them, the Massachusetts, a group of people that lived mostly in the coastal areas around what is now Greater Boston, gave the state its name, a moniker that translates at the Great Hill, which itself is a reference to the Great Blue Hill, a place south of Boston. They shared the region with other native peoples, including the Mohican, the Nauset, the Nipmuc, the Pennacook, the Pocumtuck, and the Wampanoag. The various groups all had shared cultural traits. They spoke one of the many dialects of the Algonquian language family, lived semi-sedentary lifestyles where they would grow corn, beans, and squash, collect berries, and move with the seasons, and built either longhouses or wigwams, where they lived in clans and would organize loose confederations with other settlements, each headed by a sachem, a kind of chief who would be either male or female. They also traded with each other, especially valuable things like wampum, shell beads used for ceremonies and storytelling, which the Wampanoag were famous for. Their way of life was disrupted with the arrival of the Europeans, who spent decades mapping, trading, and even kidnapping some of the natives before attempting any kind of settlement. John Cabot is the first we have record of in 1498. Later came Bartholomew Gosnold, who named Cape Cod in 1602, Samuel Champlain, who was the first to map the coast in 1605 and 1606, Henry Hudson, who briefly anchored at Cape Cod in 1609, and John Smith, who baptized the region New England in 1612. Still, it would take until 1620 for the first permanent settlement to be established, one of the most famous in American history, Plymouth Colony. As it happens, the fact that it was attempted in Massachusetts at all was entirely accidental. The people behind it, a separatist sect of English Puritans that later came to be known as pilgrims, had gotten a grant and funding to set up a colony at the mouth of the Hudson River, but they sailed late in the season and the strong winter sea prevented them from sailing past Cape Cod. Facing brutal cold and running out of provisions, they opted to disembark there, but not before writing the Mayflower Compact, a governing covenant between the settlers that attempted to legalize their position to create a colony for which they technically had no European legal basis. That first winter was brutal. Building shelter was slow and painful in the cold, and most settlers had to remain in the ship. Hunger followed. By the end of it, at least half of the 100-odd original people that had embarked had perished. Fortunately for them, in the spring, they were able to make contact with Massasoit, a local sachem, who offered an alliance of mutual defense, provided them supplies, and Tisquanto, one of his messengers who helped the colonists grow crops. It helped that Squanto, as the pilgrims called him, spoke English, something he knew because he had been kidnapped by an earlier English explorer and taken to Europe some 6 years earlier. In fact, Tisquantum, a member of the Patuxet tribe, was from the very land the pilgrims were setting up their colony in. The fact that they could do that at all was because the native village had been wiped out by an epidemic brought by the Europeans in the preceding decades. The same fate had befallen most of the natives within Algonquian territory who lacked any immunity to the disease, and it is estimated saw upwards of 90% of their population die. Indeed, this was also the reason that Massasoit was eager for a peace treaty, as his people had been weakened by disease and were facing competition from the neighboring Narragansett. No wonder both sides were happy to celebrate at Thanksgiving after the colonists' first corn growing season. Other English attempts were not so successful. Between 1623 and 1624, colonies in Weymouth and Cape Ann all failed. But Plymouth's continued success, which by then already boasted around 2,500 people, maintained interest in the area. In 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was created, which brought a new group of Puritans to New England under a fresh charter known as the Cambridge Agreement, which granted the province local control, an important measure that would allow the settlers to run the colony as they saw fit. The man who was put in charge was John Winthrop, an English lawyer that would provide crucial leadership in those early years, and who today is most remembered for his phrase, "city upon a hill," which embodied the model country the Puritans aspired to build. In June 1630, the Winthrop fleet arrived in Salem with 11 ships, a town that had been set up with the remaining colonists from the failed Cape Ann settlement. But not finding sufficient food, the newcomers continued on to what is now Charlestown, where lack of water became the problem. Fortunately for them, William Blackston, an earlier settler who had been living by himself in the area since 1625, noticed them and suggested they move to what is now Beacon Hill, as it had an excellent spring. They agreed, and the city of Boston, so named for the one in England, which was the hometown of several prominent people in the group, was officially founded in September 1630. Others looked a bit farther afield, founding both Watertown and Cambridge that same year. With better local knowledge and continued Puritan migration, the colony continued to prosper. Enough that in 1636, anticipating the need to educate their clergy, a college was founded with the simple moniker of New. Renamed Harvard in 1639 after one of its early benefactors, it is the oldest institution of higher education in the United States and central in the production of state and national leaders ever since then. The various British civil wars marked an end to the Puritan migration starting in 1639, with some colonists even returning to fight in them. This allowed for some diversification in the population of the colony, especially as fur trading, lumber, and fishing industries developed and attracted non-Puritans. Governors continued to be dominated by conservative Puritans well into the next century, however. Others chafed at this. Baptists and Quakers left to found a different colony in Rhode Island in 1636, and William Pynchon, a man who founded Springfield in 1635 and became one of the richest men in Massachusetts, wrote a book criticizing Puritan theology in 1649, only to see it burned at the Boston Common and having it be the first book banned in the New World. Natives had their own gripes. They resented in particular the Puritans' regular conversion efforts, as well as their continued land encroachment despite a peace treaty. By 1675, natives had had enough and revolted, attacking over half of the towns in New England and destroying 12 of them. Known as King Philip's War after Metacomet, the leader of the natives who took the English moniker for himself, it ended up being disastrous for the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and their allies, as they lost over 80% of their forces, while many of those who survived were enslaved and sent to Bermuda. In terms of excess for the Puritan government, however, the most famous incident was the Salem witch trials, a case of mass hysteria which ended with the death of 25 people, 4 of whom died while in custody, 19 of which were hanged, and 1 who was pressed to death. There were also conflicts with England proper and the French, the latter as part of the larger intercontinental conflicts between them and Britain, such as during King William's War in 1689, and the former as part of a struggle between Massachusetts and the British Crown for control of the colony. In 1684, King James II voided the colony's charter and 2 years later unified it with the rest of New England, New York, and New Jersey to create the Dominion of New England, which sought to streamline public administration, lower costs, and have more control over some of the unruly colonies, especially the Puritan ones. This was extremely unpopular with the locals, which resulted in several revolts, including one in Boston in 1689, which led to the arrest of Governor Sir Edmund Andros, who was sent back to England in chains. Fortunately for the colonists, the Glorious Revolution had already begun and quickly put an end to King James, and also to the Dominion. The new monarchs, William and Mary, issued a new charter in 1691, which unified the Massachusetts and Plymouth colonies, the province of Maine, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard, into a single unit, the province of Massachusetts Bay. This restored some local control, but also changed voting rights from religious qualifications to land ownership. This did not put an end to the displeasure with the crown, however, mostly because the British kept getting entangled in global conflicts with the French several times during the 18th century, bringing unwanted costs to the colonies, such as food shortages and the Royal Navy's forced recruitment of men for the war effort. Both of these resulted in riots, the former several times between 1717 and 1719, and the latter for several days in November 1747. There were also ill-advised policies from the crown that attempted to regulate trade, which only encouraged smuggling, made some Boston merchants quite rich, and others upset at the regulation. Things got worse in 1765 with the Stamp Act, a tax intended to defray the cost of British troops in North America. Asking the colonists to pay for their security was not unreasonable from the perspective of the crown, but the locals resented it as a tax that had been enacted without their consent. Organized opposition popped up in Boston, like the Loyal Nine and later the Sons of Liberty, and violence followed. The fierce response led to the repeal of the act, but the British Parliament refused to give up what it saw as its rightful power to tax the colonies, so they enacted several more regulations, lighter and stealthier from their perspective. First, the Townshend Acts in 1767 and 1768, followed by the Tea Act of 1773. Both backfired. The first led to the Boston Massacre in 1770, an incident where British soldiers shot at a harassing crowd of hundreds of people and killed 5, and the second to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, a protest that destroyed a tea shipment that was worth around $1.7 million in today's money. This escalation in turn brought a swift response from the British government, which came to be known as the Intolerable Acts of 1774. These, in essence, ended Massachusetts' right to self-government and closed the port of Boston, which the colonists responded to with boycotts, amassing of arms, and other forms of sabotage. When in April 1775 the Crown sent soldiers to find a cache of illegal weapons in the outskirts of Boston, armed conflict ensued in Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun. Massachusetts was crucial in the conflict early on. The siege of Boston forced the British to evacuate their troops to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and move the war theater to Maine and New York. The colony was not invaded again, but it did suffer raids in New Bedford and Martha's Vineyard in 1778. A successful end to the war didn't end unrest, though. The Continental Army had been quite badly paid, and many veterans returned home to debt. Massachusetts itself had the same problem, so when the government raised taxes to try to better their financial situation, they instead sparked yet another armed uprising in 1786, Shays' Rebellion. This did not result in many casualties, but their destruction convinced the colonies that their Articles of Confederation could simply not work, creating an impetus for an American Constitution, which Massachusetts ratified in 1788, making it the sixth state to do so. Massachusetts itself had gotten a new legal charter after a 1779 Constitutional Convention headed by James Bowdoin. John and Samuel Adams produced a document that explicitly laid out that all men had equal rights. It remains the longest functioning constitution in the world. Its equality clause was immediately used through the courts to abolish slavery, making Massachusetts a free state in 1783. In the early years of the American Republic, the state began to prosper as the center of the whaling industry around New Bradford, the expansion of Boston as a major trading port, and the development of the Industrial Revolution. Textile manufacturing needed water to run the mills, and Massachusetts had plenty of rivers, lakes, and canals, along with access to a major seaport, transforming the state from an agricultural hub to a manufacturing one. This was quickened with the War of 1812, whose blockade forced internal industries to develop to try to meet local demand. And thus, by the 1840s, the state had specialized manufacturing regions like paper mills in Holyoke, wool in Pittsfield, shoes and clothing in Worcester, and textiles in Lowell and Waltham. In fact, the former was itself founded specifically to be a manufacturing center in the 1820s, and by the 1850s had the largest industrial complex in the country. The state was also at the forefront of technological innovation at the hands of people like Thomas Blanchard, who pioneered machine tools and interchangeable parts. This prosperity meant a growing population, and by 1860 the state was the second most densely populated state in the country. The other thing the War of 1812 accelerated was the loss of Maine as part of Massachusetts. Boston had been completely against the war, and when the British occupied parts of Maine, Massachusetts was slow to respond, which created a lot of resentment among the locals, who began pushing for separation. This was finally made official in 1820 when Maine was admitted to the Union as the 23rd state. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution and the Irish potato famine of the 1840s brought lots of Irish immigrants to the state, a group that had existed in America since colonial times, but never at that level. This in turn created a backlash and boosted the Know-Nothings, a single-issue third party that had a near-complete sweep during the 1854 election. Their organization didn't last very long, but anti-Catholicism as a political force would be prevalent for a few decades yet. The first Irish mayor of Boston would not be elected until 1884, and the first governor until 1913. In the meantime, there was another political force that began to shape not just local, but national politics: abolitionism. Given its status as a free state, its resulting large black population, its prosperity and cultural scene, Massachusetts became a hotbed for many anti-slavery activities, including safe houses for the Underground Railroad, newspapers like The Liberator, founded by William Lloyd Garrison, abolitionist societies, not just in Boston, but also New Bedford, Springfield, and so on. For a time, in the 1840s, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and John Brown all lived in the state. Politicians in Congress representing Massachusetts echoed the abolitionist sentiment, most famously Charles Sumner, who delivered multiple scathing speeches against slavery and was beaten with a cane in the Senate floor for his trouble. Once the Civil War began, the state was key in the Union victory, producing critical amounts of materiel and sending over 150,000 men to the war effort, including several Irish regiments that would later alleviate Irish prejudice in the state, and perhaps the most famous of all, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first all-African American regiments in the Union Army. The state continued to prosper after the war, attracting more and more immigrants and becoming a leader in innovation and education, as major public works were built and higher education centers continued to appear. Between 1860 and 1900, multiple leading universities were founded, including MIT in 1860, Boston College in 1861, UMass Amherst in 1863, Smith in 1875, Clark in 1887, Northeastern in 1898, and Simmons in 1899. While Mount Holyoke, one of the oldest colleges for women in the world, founded originally as a seminary in 1837, changed its status to a collegiate charter in 1888. Some of the innovations that resulted including being the first place in the country to spawn gas-powered automobile companies, all around Greater Springfield. The strong industrial economy continued for several decades yet, but the Great Depression in the 1920s, external low-wage competition, and dependence on communities in the production of one or two goods brought down the once mighty manufacturing center. Labor unrest, economic stagnation, and urban decay followed. The two world wars brought only brief respites from this decline. The advent of the electronics and communications industries after World War II finally brought this cycle to a halt. Aided by federal money for research and development, numerous small corporations began to draw on the expertise of academics from Boston and Cambridge. High technology industry began as a suburban Boston phenomenon, but it also revitalized many of the state's larger cities, with their large abandoned mill complexes becoming home to numerous research and development firms. Along with that changeover came a dramatic rise in the service sector, notably in finance, education, and health, that made the state and its core service center, Boston, the birthplace of the new national economy of the latter half of the 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries. A skilled and resilient labor force combined with a powerful research-oriented higher educational system and innovative venture capitalists brought Massachusetts back to economic health. With a highly educated citizenry in place, it was an easy leap for Massachusetts to become a leader in biotechnology and the information revolution in the 1990s. This in turn has once again attracted immigration, although this time not from Ireland but Latin America, with 12.4% of the state's population now defined as Latino. Meanwhile, the radical politics that had once dominated the state prior to the Civil War went out of fashion and social conservatism became the norm well into World War II, with the banning of books becoming common in the 1920s and famous cases like the trial of anarchist Italian immigrants Sacco and Vanzetti dominating the headlines. Republicans dominated the state legislature for decades, but little by little Democrats became competitive in the state with pioneers in machine politics like P.J. Kennedy and John F. Fitzgerald, the respective grandparents of future President John F. Kennedy. By the 1950s, the Democrats became the majority and have not looked back, with current supermajorities in both chambers. Presidential politics have been slightly more competitive, with the state having voted for both Reagan and Eisenhower. But where it has really differed is with the governorship. Despite being a solidly blue state, 9 out of the last 16 governors in Massachusetts have been Republican, including Mitt Romney and the current one, Charlie Baker, who won re-election in 2018. This is in part because, unlike other similar states, the state legislature remains supreme, and thus Republican governors are forced to be more moderate than their equivalent elsewhere. In the last 20 years, Massachusetts has also continued its tradition as a national liberal leader. In 2004, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of same-sex marriage recognition in the state, and in 2006, it passed a healthcare law that required people to have health insurance while subsidizing those who couldn't get it, what later became the basis for Obamacare in 2009. In the meantime, despite a seemingly bright tech future, The state faces similar problems to other prosperous states in the U.S., namely housing, expanding inequality, and environmental problems. If it manages to solve them, Massachusetts can once again be a leading pioneer, a role it has played many times in its history.